The morning coffee at Sun Technologies tasted like copper pennies and regret, the kind that coated your tongue regardless of how much cream you added. I'd been sitting in the same ergonomic chair for 11 years, fingers dancing across keyboards that smelled faintly of hand sanitizer, watching the same screensaver rotate through corporate-approved nature photographs. Nobody spoke much before 9 o'clock. That was the unspoken rule. My cubicle faced the eastern windows where October light filtered through dusty glass panels. I could see the parking lot below, rows of vehicles arranged in neat lines like soldiers awaiting inspection. A silver sedan pulled in, probably Marcus, our senior analyst, arriving exactly 17 minutes before his shift started. Punctuality was his obsession. Mine was perfection, which made the morning of October 3rd feel like stepping on broken glass. The security audit had been assigned to me 2 weeks prior. Not a prestigious project by most standards, but it was meticulous work, the kind that required someone willing to sit in uncomfortable positions for hours, cross-referencing access logs and penetration test results. I'd actually wanted it. The previous year's audit had revealed vulnerabilities in our API endpoints that nobody else seemed to notice until I pointed them out during a presentation. My reputation for catching what others missed had become my defining feature at Sun Technologies. The morning meeting started at 8:45. Conference room B, same table with the wobbling leg that everyone avoided sitting near. I brought my notes, 43 pages printed and bound, color-coded tabs indicating different system categories. My supervisor, Derek Carlson, stood at the head of the table. He wore the same navy blazer he wore every Tuesday, which meant he'd had something important scheduled. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Aaron, thanks for coming in early," he began, gesturing toward the chairs. I sat. 2 other people occupied the room, Janet Moretti from compliance and a woman I didn't recognize, younger, with the kind of haircut that suggested a recent visit to an expensive salon. "We need to discuss the security audit timeline." My stomach performed a small, involuntary flip. I'd been meticulous about the schedule. Everything was on track. "The thing is," Derek continued, and that was when I noticed his jaw tightening, "we've brought in some fresh perspective. This is Chloe Vaughn from our new consultant firm. She's got recent certifications in advanced cybersecurity protocols and she'll be taking over the audit project." He said it the way someone might announce a minor scheduling adjustment, as if reassigning months of preparatory work was simply a matter of preference rather than a systematic undermining of competence. I felt my hands go cold against the table surface. "She's got fresher cybersecurity skills," Derek added, and there was something almost proud in his voice, as though he'd discovered a shortcut through a forest nobody else knew existed. "We want to make sure we're implementing the most current best practices. Nothing personal, of course. You'll still have plenty to keep you busy with routine maintenance protocols." Chloe smiled at me. It was a kind smile, which somehow made it worse. She probably didn't know that she was being handed my project. Probably didn't understand the implications of what had just been decided. She was simply a person doing her job, and somehow that made the whole thing feel inevitable rather than chosen. "I understand," I said. The words came out steady, which surprised me. I've always had a tendency toward professionalism when my stomach was falling through the floor. "I'll transition all the documentation." "Perfect," Derek said, already standing to leave. "You're a real team player, Aaron." I wasn't sure if he actually believed that or if he was simply trying to convince himself. I gathered my notes, those 43 pages that had taken weeks to prepare, and walked out of the conference room without making eye contact with anyone. The rest of the day moved like underwater footage. I submitted my research to Chloe through the shared drive. I responded to emails about other projects with what felt like an acceptable level of professional engagement. I ate lunch alone at my desk, a sad container of leftover pasta that I'd prepared the night before, not because I was hungry but because sitting in the break room felt impossible. Around 3 o'clock, I helped someone troubleshoot a printer issue. That felt good, actually, solving a problem, being useful for something small and contained. That evening, I drove home on autopilot, my route so familiar that I could navigate it with half my attention. The apartment was quiet in that particular way apartments become when you live alone. I had a cat named Sterling, a gray tabby with one slightly crooked ear that I'd adopted from a shelter 4 years ago. Sterling had the kind of personality that suggested she was primarily interested in meal times and the occasional demand for lap access. Tonight she wound between my ankles, sensing perhaps that something had shifted in the domestic balance. I made tea. The kettle whistled, a small sound that filled the kitchen. I stood at the window, watching the neighborhood settle into evening, lights turning on in adjacent apartments, the sound of someone's television drifting through thin walls. The city beyond the neighborhood glowed softly, a sprawl of human activity that continued regardless of individual disappointments. That was oddly comforting. The world didn't pause for our small setbacks. Sterling jumped onto the windowsill beside me, and I reached over to scratch behind her ears. She purred, a mechanical sound that felt honest in a way that little else did that day. "It's fine," I told her, and I almost believed it. 3 days passed with the particular quality of time when you're waiting for something to feel normal again. I fell back into my routines, arriving at 7:30, the coffee at my desk by 7:45, my standard projects distributed throughout the day. The company's systems hummed along with their usual efficiency. Nothing seemed broken. Nobody seemed to notice that anything had changed. Chloe sent me a friendly email on day 2, thanking me for the documentation and asking if I had any additional insights about the company's security infrastructure. Her tone was genuinely appreciative, which made it harder to dislike her. I responded professionally, providing 3 suggestions about potential areas for deeper investigation. I didn't tell her about the inconsistencies I'd noticed in the quarterly reports, small things that probably weren't important, but which had triggered my instincts about pattern recognition. By Thursday morning, something felt different. It started with a feeling rather than anything concrete. I was at my desk, finishing a routine update to our department's access control systems, when I noticed something odd about the audit project folder. Chloe had created several new files, which was expected. But there was a subfolder labeled External Review that hadn't been there the day before, and it contained a compressed file that was significantly larger than I would have anticipated for preliminary report documentation. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that even as I was clicking on it. But there's something about the instinct to understand inconsistencies that overrides professional boundaries sometimes. The file wouldn't open, it was corrupted or encrypted in a way my system couldn't parse. That alone was unusual. Most of our project files were standardized, documented, accessible. I made a note of it and continued with my morning. Around 11 o'clock, I overheard a conversation in the break room. 2 people from the accounting department were discussing something about security concerns and Derek needing to file additional documentation with compliance. Their voices were low, the kind of hushed tone that suggested they understood they might be discussing something sensitive. I poured water for tea and tried to appear disinterested, which is harder than it sounds when you're actively listening. "Doesn't make sense that they'd hire an external consultant now," one of them was saying. "The audit's already been allocated budget through the end of the quarter." "Maybe they found something," the other replied. "Something that required specialist input." Their conversation ended as I filled my mug, but the implication lingered. Found something. As if Chloe had uncovered a problem during her initial review, something serious enough to warrant secrecy and supplementary consultation. I took my tea back to my desk and sat there, fingers resting on the keyboard, mind working through possibilities. It didn't make sense. The systems I'd reviewed had been stable. Maybe Chloe had discovered something that I'd missed, but that seemed unlikely given how thoroughly I'd prepared. Or maybe it was something else entirely, an administrative issue unrelated to the actual security infrastructure. The problem with working in cybersecurity is that you become attuned to deception. You spend your career looking for people trying to hide things, for systems that don't match their documented specifications. After a while, that instinct becomes part of you. You start seeing potential betrayals in normal situations. Thursday afternoon, around 3, I noticed Derek walking past my cubicle with Chloe. They were speaking quietly, and Derek's expression was pinched in a way that suggested stress. Chloe was holding a folder, a physical one, not digital, and she was gesturing towards something on her tablet. They disappeared into Derek's office and the door closed. I waited approximately 40 minutes before I did something I'd never done before. I walked past Derek's office and glanced through the small window in his door. They were still there, seated on opposite sides of his desk, and Derek was rubbing his forehead as though dealing with a migraine. Chloe was speaking, her mouth moving with the intensity of someone explaining something complicated and important. I continued walking to the restroom, feeling vaguely guilty for looking. That evening, I sat at home and opened my personal laptop, the one I used for freelance work, separate from any company systems. I pulled up the internal Sun Technologies directory and searched for information about Chloe Vaughn. Her profile was sparse, a photograph showing a woman with the same expensive haircut, a brief biography indicating experience with 3 previous firms, and credentials that were certainly impressive on paper. Advanced certifications from recognized institutions. Consulting experience with Fortune 500 companies. The kind of resume that looked designed to impress. I don't know what I was looking for. Some indication that my instincts were correct? Some evidence that Derek had made a mistake? I found nothing concrete, just the standard profile that any competent professional would have assembled. Sterling curled up on my lap while I worked, purring softly. I scratched her chin absently, my mind circling the same questions repeatedly. Why had Derek removed me from the audit? Was it truly just about bringing in fresher skills, or was there something else? And what was the issue that seemed to have emerged after Chloe's review began? The questions felt like stones in my stomach. I didn't sleep well that night. Friday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes after a difficult night. I'd woken at 4 a.m. and hadn't been able to fall back asleep, so I'd spent the early hours researching. Not anything concerning, just reviewing industry news, reading about recent cybersecurity breaches at other companies, reminding myself of best practices I'd learned years ago. It was a way of calming my mind, of focusing on something concrete and manageable. I arrived at Sun Technologies earlier than usual, the parking lot still relatively empty. The building felt different in the early morning, quieter, more exposed. I made my coffee and settled at my desk, working through routine maintenance tasks that didn't require much creative energy. Around 8:30, before most people had arrived, I received an email from Derek requesting a meeting in his office. No details, just a request. My heart rate increased marginally, which I recognized as an unnecessary physiological response. It was probably nothing, some administrative matter, a task assignment, routine business. And yet my mind immediately began cataloging all the ways it could be something more serious. Derek was already at his desk when I arrived, and he looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from stress rather than simple lack of sleep. His navy blazer was already shed, draped across the back of his chair. He gestured for me to sit. "How are things going with your current projects?" he asked, which seemed like an odd way to start a conversation when he'd called me there specifically. "Fine," I replied. "Routine maintenance is on schedule. I'm making progress on the system updates we discussed last month." Good, Derek said, and he paused for a moment, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I wanted to check in about the audit transition. How are you feeling about that?" The question felt loaded. I considered how to answer honestly without revealing that I'd noticed his stress, Chloe's mysterious meetings, the encrypted files I wasn't supposed to be thinking about. "It's fine," I said. "Chloe seems competent. I'm sure the external perspective will be valuable." "Right." Derek leaned back in his chair. "The thing is, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Have you noticed anything unusual about our security systems lately? Any access logs that seemed off, any suspicious activity, anything that struck you as potentially problematic?" My mind immediately went to the encrypted subfolder. To the conversation in the break room about finding something. To the late-night meetings between Derek and Chloe. Nothing concrete, I answered, which was technically true. There were some minor inconsistencies in the quarterly reports, but nothing that seemed urgent. I hadn't completed my full analysis yet. Derek's expression tightened. "What kind of inconsistencies?" I decided to be more specific. Timestamp discrepancies in a few access logs. Some activity that didn't match the documented access schedules for certain systems. Small things that could have been documentation errors or system lag, but they seemed worth investigating more thoroughly. Derek stood up abruptly and walked to the window. He stood there for a moment, his back to me, his shoulders tense. When he turned back around, his face had changed. The careful professionalism had been replaced by something that looked like controlled panic. "Aaron, I need to know if you've shared any of these observations with anyone else. Not including me just now." "No," I said. I documented them in my preliminary notes, but I was still in the investigation phase. "Who has access to those notes?" "They're on the shared drive," I said slowly. "The audit project folder. Chloe has access to them." Derek's jaw clenched visibly. He sat back down and seemed to be making a significant effort to breathe normally. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I need you to stay quiet about what we just discussed. Don't talk to Chloe about your observations. Don't mention this conversation to anyone. And if anyone asks you about security concerns or potential system compromises, come to me directly. Can you do that? Of course, I said, and it was then that I understood something was genuinely wrong. Not wrong in the way that professional disappointments are wrong, but wrong in a way that was serious and potentially dangerous. I left Derek's office and walked back to my desk in a state of controlled confusion. The morning had shifted from routine to something else entirely. I spent the next 2 hours working through the same tasks I'd started earlier, my mind simultaneously present and somewhere else, spinning through implications and possibilities. Around 10:30, my direct work line rang. It was Janet Moretti from Compliance. "Erin, do you have a moment?" she asked. Her voice sounded formal in a way that suggested this wasn't a casual check-in. "Yes, what can I help you with?" I replied. "I need to discuss your documentation from the audit project. Specifically, your preliminary access log analysis. Can you come to my office?" My stomach performed another involuntary flip. I felt like I was watching events unfold rather than actively participating in them. Everything was moving too quickly and yet somehow also in slow motion. Janet's office was on the 4th floor, a larger space than mine that reflected her role in the company's regulatory framework. She was sitting at her desk, and she gestured for me to close the door behind me when I entered. That gesture alone conveyed something important about the nature of our conversation. "I've been reviewing the documentation you provided for the security audit," Janet began without preamble. "Specifically, your notes on the access log inconsistencies. These are concerning from a compliance perspective." They seemed minor to me, I offered, though I was beginning to understand that my assessment had been incorrect. "They would be, if they didn't align with some other information that's come to light recently," Janet said carefully. She opened a folder on her desk and withdrew several pages of printed reports. "We've discovered that someone with elevated system privileges has been accessing databases they shouldn't have authorization for. The timestamps match several of the discrepancies you noted." My mind immediately went to Chloe. To the encrypted folder. To Derek's sudden stress and the urgent nature of this conversation. "Who?" I asked. Janet hesitated. She seemed to be weighing how much to tell me. "That's what we're still trying to determine," she said finally. "But I wanted to speak with you because your preliminary work might be critical to understanding the scope of the issue. The fact that you identified these inconsistencies suggests you have a strong grasp on what normal access patterns should look like." "You're saying someone's been stealing data," I said, and it wasn't a question. "We're saying that someone may have accessed information they weren't authorized to access," Janet replied carefully. "We're still investigating. But this is now a formal compliance matter, and I need your commitment to maintain confidentiality while we work through this." I agreed immediately. We spent the next 40 minutes going through my notes in detail, and I explained my reasoning for flagging each inconsistency. Janet took additional notes, asked clarifying questions, and gradually revealed a picture that became increasingly troubling. Someone at Sun Technologies had been compromising system security, and my observations had potentially been the first indication that something was wrong. When I finally left Janet's office, I felt like I was carrying something heavy. The weight of understanding that the company I'd worked at for 11 years had been infiltrated. That security protocols had been violated. That the casual removal from the audit project had nothing to do with fresher skills and everything to do with someone at the company trying to keep the investigation quiet. The afternoon passed in a strange fog. I returned to my desk and continued with my routine tasks, but my concentration was fractured. I found myself watching people, observing their movements, wondering if I was looking at the person responsible for the security breach. Was it someone in tech services? Someone in database management? Could it even be someone outside the company who'd found their way into the system? Around 4 o'clock, I noticed Derek walking past my cubicle again. He paused briefly and made eye contact with me, a meaningful glance that suggested he knew I'd been called into Janet's office. I gave a small nod to indicate that I'd maintained confidentiality as requested. That evening, I sat at home and processed everything. Sterling, sensing my agitation, stayed close, offering silent companionship. I considered the implications of what I'd learned. Someone had exploited system vulnerabilities that I would have discovered if I'd continued with the audit. The removal from the project took on an entirely different meaning now. It wasn't about bringing in fresh skills. It was about someone trying to derail the investigation, maybe not deliberately, but certainly the effect was the same. I thought about Chloe and her encrypted files. I thought about Derek's stressed appearance and his urgent questions. I thought about the security breach that was happening at a company where I'd spent 11 years building expertise and trust. And I thought about the fact that I'd said nothing when Derek had casually removed me from the audit. I'd accepted it professionally, as though my work meant nothing, as though my 11 years of competence could be set aside with a single conversation. Maybe if I'd pushed back, if I'd questioned the decision, none of this would have happened. That was probably unfair to myself, but it felt true in that moment. Monday morning arrived with a weight that I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent the weekend in a state of suspended animation, not working, but not quite resting either. Sterling had sensed my mood and had spent most of the weekend curled against me, offering the kind of non-judgmental presence that animals provide. I arrived at the office to find the entire fourth floor in a state of controlled chaos. People were speaking in hushed tones, moving quickly between offices. There was an energy that suggested something significant had happened. I learned the truth around 9 o'clock, when an all-hands email went out from Derek and Janet. As part of our commitment to maintaining the highest standards of compliance and security, we have initiated a comprehensive investigation into a potential breach of our access control protocols. An external forensic team has been brought in to conduct a thorough review. During this time, we request your full cooperation and patience as we work to ensure the integrity of our systems. We will provide updates as the situation develops. Any questions should be directed to our compliance department. The email was written in corporate language, but the meaning was clear: someone had gotten caught. By mid-morning, whispers had circulated through the department indicating that the breach was significant, thousands of customer records potentially compromised, data related to client accounts and personal information. It was the kind of security failure that could destroy a company's reputation, that might result in regulatory action and lawsuits. I worked methodically through the day, doing my job, staying quiet. Around 2 o'clock, Derek called an emergency meeting for anyone who'd been involved in security-related projects in the past 12 months. This included me, despite my removal from the audit. Conference room C this time, larger and more formal. Derek stood at the front, and he looked like he'd aged years in the past 4 days. Janet was there too, along with an older woman I didn't recognize, probably someone from the forensic team. We're in the process of determining exactly what happened and when, Derek began. But we have preliminary findings that I need to share with you all, and then we'll need individual interviews with each person in this room. He took a breath. It appears that Chloe Vaughn, our consultant, manipulated her way into our systems and extracted a significant amount of data over the past 3 weeks. She had access to project information because of her role in the audit, and she exploited that access to obtain customer records that she then sold to a third party. We discovered the breach when our financial department identified unusual payment transactions to an offshore account that Chloe had set up. The room felt very quiet. I saw people processing this information, the shock of betrayal, the understanding that someone who had seemed professional and competent had actually been deliberately sabotaging the company. How did she get past the security protocols? Someone asked. She used basic social engineering to convince several people to grant her elevated access, the woman from the forensic team replied. She told different people different stories, that she needed access for audit purposes, that she was requesting access on behalf of Derek, that she was working on a special project. Because she seemed competent and professional, people gave her what she asked for. I felt something shift inside me. Chloe hadn't been brought in to review the audit objectively. She'd been brought in as part of a deliberate plan to exploit system vulnerabilities and steal data. The fresher skills comment Derek had made, that had been either genuine ignorance or deliberate deception on his part. What happens now? Someone else asked. We're conducting a full security reset, Janet explained. All access privileges are being revoked and reassigned. All systems are being reviewed for additional unauthorized access. And we're cooperating fully with law enforcement, as this appears to be industrial espionage. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering various aspects of the investigation and the remediation process. But my mind had latched onto one particular question that nobody was asking. After the meeting ended, I waited until most people had left the conference room. Derek was gathering his notes when I approached him. Derek, can I ask you something? I said quietly. He looked up. His face was exhausted, but something in his expression seemed to indicate that he'd been waiting for this conversation. Of course, he replied. Did you know? I asked. When you removed me from the audit, did you know that Chloe was going to cause problems? Derek set down his paper slowly. He took a moment before responding, and when he did, his voice was careful. No, he said. I genuinely believed her credentials. But looking back, I realized there were signs I should have caught. Her references checked out, or seemed to, but nobody actually spoke directly with the people who'd worked with her before. I should have been more thorough. That was my failure as a manager. But you knew something was wrong, I pressed. When you brought me into your office on Friday morning, you already suspected something. Yes, Derek admitted. Chloe had accessed files she shouldn't have been able to access. And when I confronted her about it, she claimed it was a documentation error. But something felt off, so I escalated it to Janet. Within a few hours, we'd identified the pattern. And you removed me from the audit before that even happened, I said quietly. Derek's expression changed. I could see him understanding what I was implying. I didn't remove you because I knew Chloe was compromised, he said slowly. I removed you because I genuinely thought she had stronger credentials. But in doing that, I also prevented you from being part of the investigation that would have proven you were right about those inconsistencies. The irony hung between us like a suspended object, heavy and undeniable. If Derek had kept me on the audit, I would have discovered the breach immediately. Chloe wouldn't have had time to extract data. The entire situation would have been prevented. I'm sorry, Derek said, and he meant it. I could see that he absolutely meant it. What happens to her? I asked. Law enforcement is pursuing charges, Derek replied. She's currently in custody pending arraignment. There will be a full investigation, and she'll likely face significant prison time for what she's done. I nodded slowly, processing this information. The woman who'd seemed so competent, so professional, was actually engaged in felony data theft. The company would survive. Sun Technologies had resources to weather this storm, but it would be changed. Customer trust would be damaged. The company's reputation would take years to rebuild. What happens to you? I asked Derek. He looked at me directly. That's being determined. There will be a board review of my decision-making process. I likely won't survive that review. The consensus is that I exercised poor judgment, and in cybersecurity, poor judgment at the management level is grounds for dismissal. I didn't feel triumph when I heard the news, only a quiet sympathy. Derek's mistake wasn't malicious, it came from misplaced confidence and poor diligence. You made a human error, I told him. Chloe deceived people. Those aren't the same. He nodded, unconsoled. Within a week, Sun Technologies announced new protocols and hired a temporary security director. Chloe was arrested, charged with wire fraud and industrial espionage, part of a data theft ring selling stolen tech information. Derek was terminated for failure of oversight. No one blamed him publicly, but everyone understood. Legal and forensics brought me in to review my audit findings. Janet Moretti later told me, your work prevented far greater damage. You paid attention when something seemed off. She paused. Integrity matters even when it's not rewarded right away. Weeks later, the new CISO, Patricia, called me in. Your audit was exceptional, she said. I'm restructuring the team. I want you to lead compliance and audits, a promotion, raise, and staff. Interested? Yes, I said, finally feeling seen. 3 months later, I sat in my new 4th-floor office, larger than my old cubicle, with a view of the parking lot where I'd once watched Marcus arrive that October morning. The board had approved my promotion and salary increase, and I now led a team of 3 implementing new security protocols Patricia had signed off on. Chloe had pled guilty and was sentenced to 7 years. She'd been part of an international data theft ring targeting regional tech firms. Sun Technologies faced a class action, but the damage was manageable. Derek had landed a lesser management job elsewhere. When we crossed paths once, we exchanged polite small talk. I felt no bitterness. His downfall stemmed from arrogance, not malice. At home, Sterling twined around my ankles as I cooked dinner, grilled chicken, roasted vegetables. I thought back to that October meeting when Derek had removed me from the audit. I'd mistaken it for failure, but it was never about my competence. I'd done my job, documented the truth, and stayed professional. Integrity, I realized, was its own quiet form of justice, the kind that endures long after the noise fades.